Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guests today are Teresa Shea, Vice President of Cyber Offense and Defense Experts at Raytheon, Alexis Wales, Deputy Associate Director, Threat Hunting, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, Karen Evans, the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security and Emergency Response at the Department of Energy, Amalé Karan, Deputy Chief Information Officer, Office of the Inspector General at the Department of Health and Human Services, and Colonel Darcy St. Amant, Military Deputy, Operations Center, Defense Information Systems Agency. Welcome to all of you. Thanks so much for being here. Very excited about this panel. I want to start off by talking to you about cyber threats, which have, of course, dramatically changed over the last several years. General Keith Alexander, the former NSA director, warned the IT community about disruptive cyber attacks 10 years ago. Obviously, there's been a lot of progress since then, certainly over the last few years. But when it comes to protecting systems and data, 10 years after that warning from General Alexander, does it still apply today? Is it something you are still concerned about? And what are you warning your colleagues about?
Yes, so you asked about, does it still apply today? Yes, those warnings still apply today that were mentioned 10 years ago, unfortunately. So we do still combat the basic hygiene and patching challenges that we know how to resolve. And so it's a culture issue as well as resource challenges. But more importantly, I think I warn my colleagues about a warning that Peter Singer gave in his book, Like Wars. Not so much worried about the hacking of the ones and zeros, but the hacking of the cognitive space.
Amalé?
Well, generally, 10 years ago, we weren't in the cloud. So the landscape in which we play is actually very much different. Some of the controls that we use or are referring to needed to be updated. We're still learning how to apply them efficiently, but the methods for attack and defense have definitely changed. So it requires us to constantly adapt for the new environments that we find ourselves playing in.
Interesting. Karen?
So 10 years ago, I was there when General Alexander said that. So that was a lot of my responsibilities. But what I'm in here now in this new role is, as a sector-specific agency, focused very outwardly on working with our private industry partners. And so I would say that the threat is there, but even more increasing, as my colleagues have said. Also, as we look at what was in the D&I Worldwide Threat Assessment that came out, we're very focused on nation-state adversaries of what they can do in the critical infrastructure as it affects the American people and what our private industry partners have to face.
Alexis?
So yes, agreed. From the Department of Homeland Security's perspective, we continue to look at the challenge from an enterprise perspective. We are looking at cross-sector solutions with the sector-specific agencies like our colleagues on this panel. We are as concerned today, if not more so, about changing tactics, techniques, and procedures of the adversary. We have not backed off of any of our warnings. In fact, we've started to ensure that, especially during the month of October, during Cybersecurity Awareness Month, that we are making sure that both individuals and those that are responsible for the collective are aware of those nation-state actors that we are most concerned about, and also of the protective measures that they should be taking on a daily basis themselves.
Teresa, do you want to weigh in?
I think the only thing I would add, because I agree with everything everybody has said, is I do think looking forward, it is going to be a lot about the data. If you look at the predictions in 2025, they're talking about 175 zettabytes of data. And if you don't know what a zettabyte is, it's 1 million gigabytes. So multiply that times 175, that's a lot of data. And we need to have more resiliency in expecting our data to be available, to be authentic, and to have integrity. So I do think that that's going to be something we're going to have to face. And we're not going to solve it with just people. We also need to bring technology to that space.
I want to talk to you about how your specific agencies stay up to date and flexible in this changing environment? Because I guess we can all agree that it is changing very rapidly. Tell us, Alexis, about your biggest challenges right now.
So our biggest challenges outside of the increasing capabilities of our nation-state actors across the globe is ensuring that the network defenders that we service with information are able to access and apply, we like to say action, the information that we provide as quickly as possible, and to make these risk-informed decisions in a very intelligent manner. Oftentimes we struggle to make sure that we get that information into the hands of the appropriate action officer or person who can take an action. And we want to ensure that as often as we are able, that we are meeting with and working with private industry and that the message is shared across the board.
Just to follow up on that, is there more of a threat, do you think, from hackers getting into your systems or from an adversary, a nation-state adversary, for example, doing actual physical harm to your assets?
I would say that we are finding actors are already in the systems. And at this point, we are ensuring that we are remediating where we are finding them as quickly as possible, that we are helping to mitigate before further damage is done. But I think that from the Department of Homeland Security's perspective, the days of just securing the perimeter are over. And we are ensuring that we have the visibility, which is something that we glean from tight partnerships with those that operate at a much more closer to the endpoint level are in place. So we have that concern that the perimeter has been breached in many cases and that we now need to arm folks with the information to take care of what could be occurring currently on their networks.
Karen, your agency secures the nation's energy grid and the country's electric infrastructure. You have to respond to both natural and man-made threats. Talk a little bit about how varied your responses are based on the sector that is targeted.
So I'd like to build off of that a little bit more, especially some of the stuff that my colleagues from DHS has said here, is that when we look at it, it's an all hazards approach, right? But the key in the previous comments were about the partnership with private industry. So yes, we have a national security aspect associated with this, but the infrastructure is owned by private industry. So 90% of the infrastructure is owned by private industry. So we won't be successful. So when you're asking about the response, it's a whole government response that we take. So we do it jointly with DHS and depending on if it's pipelines or whatever, with Department of Transportation, whoever it is. But our key partners in response are our private industry partners. And so when we do this, you are seeing private industry actually respond, right? So the easiest way or the most visible way is when a natural disaster happens. You see how they have the mutual assistance agreements in place. They work very closely together with information that's coming from the government, and we help move roadblocks out of the way so that they can do the restoration of the services. So if there are waivers that they need from the government, that's what we work on. If they need to have coordination between FAAs, drones, and all, we work on all of that collectively as a government, but you see them move around, and what you hear is, utilities from New England are coming down to help Florida, right? Or Florida's going over to help Mississippi. That's because they have the mutual assistance agreements in place. And so they work in a very coordinated way, and cyber to them is just another response effort. So they have mutual assistance agreements in place as it relates to cyber resources as well.
Darcy, did you want to talk a little bit about that as well?
Well, I would also echo what my colleagues here have said, especially with Teresa's point about data security. So we have to not only look at network security as we have always done, but more increasingly more granular security focused on the data and where it goes as it resides on-prem, off-prem, in the cloud, and as it moves through a variety of applications. And so that's important, but also getting to a more automated response to get to machine speed and be less reactive and more proactive.
I want to talk a little bit about that. Before we get to reactive and proactive, which is an important topic. You mentioned the partnership with the private community. We hear a lot about so-called bad actors getting into systems through the supply chain. I guess I want to hear from you all about how concerned you are within your agencies about that, and how do you protect about what some say is the weak link in the supply chain?
Overall, technology, both the technology we actually implement for our own services, citizen services and so forth that we provide as a government, but also in the areas that we regulate, such as healthcare, deal with supply chain security very differently. You know, in healthcare, you would tend to think about the hardware that goes in there, your insulin pumps and so forth, and you have to think about the suppliers for that, whether or not they're the domestic or foreign. But also at the software level, for us, there's a bit from Department of Commerce, the software bill of materials. And for that is you basically get, like you would, an ingredients list. And you can trace your versions, where they've come from. Many, both hardware and software programs, institute open source software, so it gives some sense of, you know, this is what makes up my cereal, essentially. And when you know that, you at least have a better idea of the risk you have within your organization and the systems that you're running, but also helps direct the kind of response if you do find a vulnerability, such as when I was at the White House when we had Heartbleed. Most people just thought about websites, and then it was realized that these libraries also exist in your network hardware, your mobile phones, and so forth, so it actually expanded the response.
Wow. Karen?
So in our sector, we have a project in my office called Cytrix, which is dealing specifically with supply chain risk management. We also have the national labs, which is wonderful. We leverage those capabilities going across the board, and so we look at the supply chain for anything that plugs into the grid. So, you know, we were talking about the changing of technology, the Internet of Things, you know, your smart car, the wind turbine, solar panels. I mean, these are all really cool things that consumers want to use, that our nation wants to use, and we want to keep the innovation going because we are now energy secure, right? So we're energy independent, so we have energy security, but now we have energy insecurity with these new devices. So we are looking at that. The longer play in the department is we have an advanced manufacturing initiative that will stand up a cyber institute that will actually look at the manufacturing of all these parts and components and make recommendations so that we can actually get down to chip layers and those types of things, so that the American people will have secure devices when they install like a Nest system in their house to control temperature.
Wow, that's so interesting. I guess my question is then, is there room for improvement, Alexis and Teresa, you can weigh in on that. And where do you see this partnership going in the future?
So I would, just to start, note that the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's *2 operational priority is supply chain risk management. As an agency, we have determined that this is something we cannot move away from. So when we are working with any of our programs right now, it is to the benefit of those practitioners in this space. Everything that my colleagues have said on the panel, we agree with and we are supportive of. We're working very closely with NIST and with the Office of Management and Budget to ensure that guidance is provided to those that are in need of it for best practices and improvements. And we continue to explore ways that we ourselves can protect and secure the supply chain from an enterprise level.
Yeah, so I would just say, Karen, Alexis, making the point about the interconnectedness of all devices now, and the awareness, I think, is becoming more and more prevalent. And with that awareness, I think there is a common push for situational understanding of what's on your network, what's it doing, do I care, and if I care, what do I need to do about it? So we're pushing more into the kinds of capabilities that provide that kind of visibility into networks. And also, I think the other key piece here with supply chain is about the incident response and the ability to practice that both on as your network, having your suppliers practice it with you and you practice it with them. Because you have to assume you are breached. If you don't have somebody, bad actor in your network today, assume it's going to happen and act that way.
I want to talk a little bit about the biggest new trends in cyber tech that you guys have your eyes on and your fingers on. I also want to talk about the cyber vulnerabilities that perhaps keep you up at night. What are the biggest trends in cyber tech, I guess would be the best way to put that? What's on the horizon that excites you, that your agencies are looking forward to implementing, that perhaps you're experimenting with at this point? Amalé, would you like to start?
The thing that actually excites me is less on tech. It's actually on a policy and procedure, which is the vulnerability disclosure programs. Getting people and organizations to have a process to report vulnerabilities and know that there's actually a chance for them to get fixed, that is trackable, that there's a relationship with security researchers and the public and the developers of those systems, as well as the government overall, as they provide oversight and regulation. For me, as a technologist, it's great to think about technology, but we talked about before, it's actually a lot of people aspects too, and building those relationships and that trust. So that's usually where I kind of see where our gains are going to be.
Karen?
Well, so we're very focused on the nexus between IT and operational technology, the SCADA systems that you hear about, those types of things. So we're very focused there. So I have a research and development component underneath me, so I am very excited about some of the things that we're looking at. So for example, there are certain research that we have underway that will help us with a software-defined network, which then will actually make it self-healing in transit. So if we know what the techniques are, I'm trying not to use a lot of acronyms here. So if we know what the techniques are, we can then pre-program in advance, and we can help our industry partners by already trying to address those while in transit. So we have some of these pilots already running, and so we partner with our industry partners so that we can test out, kind of goes from a theory white paper to let's move it into an operational environment. We're also experimenting with quantum and the ability to use quantum networks and quantum key distribution, which gets to the data, so that we can then make sure that the data is the data from that perspective. And so I think between a couple of those, it would then get us to what I call getting the noise out of the system and really being able to see where are they and how can we get them out, and then how do we keep them out once they're there.
Interesting. Alexis?
I would agree with my colleagues here. There is a lot of exciting technology that is coming on the market. The Department of Homeland Security is working through acquisition processes to ensure that we are able to kind of test drive it where appropriate, look at what solutions scale, but most importantly to our customer base, if you will, which is a very large and diverse group of network defenders, host level defenders, et cetera. We are trying to make sure that whatever it is that we deploy, and this gets very close to what was already mentioned, is something that is easily consumable by the person that is looking at it. So if we are supporting a CISO, or if we are supporting a CIO, or if we are supporting the senior risk management person, we are trying to make sure that they see what they need to see and they understand how to use that information. There's quite a bit of technology that can service quite a bit of data. But it's about understanding what you're seeing and understanding what actions you are able to take that will actually lead to a more secure outcome for your organization.
I'm your moderator, Deborah Feinstein, on the panel discussion, Women Leading the Way in Government Cybersecurity, sponsored by Raytheon on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.